Paul sat hunched over a small rickety table in a dimly lit apartment that smelled faintly of mildew and despair. The contrast between his current surroundings and the opulence he had known was stark, almost cinematic. Once a towering figure in the world of real estate, Paul had built a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up. He was known throughout the city as a philanthropist, a generous employer, and an unshakable friend. Now he was unrecognizable, a man dressed in faded clothes, nursing a bowl of instant noodles in a neighborhood no one associated with success. But this wasn't an accident. It was the result of a calculated decision. Paul had orchestrated his own financial demise, meticulously crafting a story of misfortune, a collapsed market, bad investments, and legal troubles that left him stripped of his wealth. His assets were frozen, his cars and properties seized, and his once coveted life dismantled overnight. Only a few knew the truth, that Paul's fall from grace was an elaborate experiment to test the people he held closest, especially his best friend Tom. Tom had been in Paul's life for as long as he could remember. They grew up together, sharing dreams of escaping their modest beginnings. While Paul pursued real estate with relentless ambition, Tom took a steadier, less lucrative path in construction. Despite their differences, they remained inseparable. When Paul struck gold, Tom was by his side, always ready with advice or a beer in hand to celebrate another victory. But as Paul's success ballooned, he couldn't help but notice subtle changes in their dynamic. Moments of envy that Tom tried to mask with humor, unspoken tension that simmered beneath their conversations. The experiment wasn't born of paranoia but curiosity. Would Tom's loyalty endure if Paul were no longer the powerful benefactor? Would their friendship survive without the cushion of wealth? Paul needed answers, and the only way to find them was to tear everything down. Sitting in his dingy apartment, Paul mulled over his decision. He had taken to frequenting local spots where Tom and other acquaintances spent their time, blending into the background. One of those places was Murphy's, a bustling bar downtown, where the regulars nursed cheap drinks and aired their grievances. It was here, on a rainy Friday night, that Paul overheard the conversation that would shake him to his core. Hidden in the shadows of a booth, Paul watched as Tom leaned casually against the bar, surrounded by familiar faces. The conversation started innocuously, banter about work and the latest sports game, but shifted when someone brought up Paul's recent troubles. "Man, it's crazy how quickly it all fell apart for him," one of the men said, shaking his head. "You'd think someone like Paul would have had a safety net." Tom took a swig of his beer and shrugged, his tone nonchalant but cutting. "Paul always thought he was invincible. Never really listened to advice, you know. I tried to warn him a few times, but he was too proud." Paul's stomach tightened. Warn him? Tom had never expressed concern about any of Paul's decisions, at least, not to his face. The group laughed, the sound grating in Paul's ears. But it was what Tom said next that left him stunned. "Honestly, I think he needed this. Guy's been riding high for so long, he forgot what it's like to struggle. Maybe losing everything will teach him some humility." The words hit Paul like a physical blow. He had expected disappointment, perhaps even pity, but not this. Tom, his closest friend, wasn't just distancing himself, he was reveling in Paul's misfortune. As the laughter faded into the ambient noise of the bar, Paul felt a cold resolve settle over him. He needed to dig deeper, to see how far this betrayal went. Over the next few weeks, Paul orchestrated more opportunities to observe Tom and others in his circle. He started appearing in places where their paths might cross: a diner where Tom often grabbed lunch, the community center where Paul had once been a prominent donor. Each interaction was carefully staged to appear coincidental. To Paul's dismay, Tom's behavior grew more disheartening. When Paul approached him casually at the diner, Tom barely made eye contact, mumbling an excuse about being late for a meeting. When Paul mentioned needing help finding work, Tom deflected, offering vague promises to look into it that never materialized. But the most revealing moment came one afternoon at the community center. Paul had taken a volunteer shift, helping sort donations for a food drive. To his surprise, Tom arrived with a camera crew in tow. He was there to present a check, a substantial donation to the center on behalf of his construction company. Paul watched from the sidelines as Tom gave an impassioned speech about giving back to the community, painting himself as a self-made man who understood the struggles of those in need. "And I have to thank my friend Paul for inspiring me," Tom said, his voice heavy with feigned sincerity. "Seeing his situation reminded me how important it is to support one another. We can't let pride stop us from lending a hand." Paul's jaw clenched. It wasn't just that Tom was using his name to bolster his image. It was the audacity of it all. This was a man who had done nothing to help Paul when he'd needed it most, now pretending to be his savior. Paul turned away, unable to stomach the applause that followed. Later that evening, back in his apartment, Paul stared out the window at the flickering streetlights. His experiment had uncovered truths he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Tom wasn't the friend he thought he was. But as painful as the revelation was, it also brought clarity. Paul's wealth had shielded him from seeing people's true colors. Now, stripped of his fortune, he could see clearly who stood by him, and who only stood with him when the sun was shining. And yet Paul couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd imagined, but he still needed to confront Tom directly. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for the community that had always looked up to him. He had one final card to play, and he intended to use it. The experiment wasn't over yet. Paul's days began to blur together as he adjusted to his new life in obscurity. The luxury cars, tailored suits, and private dinners with city elites felt like distant memories. His mornings now started with the screech of old bus brakes outside his apartment window and the smell of burnt coffee from the corner diner, where he worked as a dishwasher. Though he had never planned to live this way, the routine began to grow on him. The simplicity of it was almost soothing, until he remembered why he was doing this. Every day, he carried the burden of betrayal, each encounter with Tom further solidifying the harsh reality he could no longer deny. Despite the pain, Paul knew he couldn't back out of his experiment. His focus shifted from self-pity to determination. If Tom had been deceitful, what about the rest of the people in Paul's circle? He decided to broaden his scope, testing not just Tom but others he trusted implicitly over the years. Among them were his longtime accountant, Sarah, and an old business associate, Greg. Paul devised careful, subtle ways to gauge their reactions and loyalty without revealing his hand. One rainy afternoon, Paul called Sarah. He used a prepaid phone to avoid suspicion, explaining his fabricated plight as if it were real. He told her his financial collapse had left him destitute and asked if she might be able to loan him a small amount to get back on his feet. To his dismay, Sarah's response was cold and transactional. "Paul, I'm really sorry to hear that," she said, her tone clipped. "But you know how tight things are for me right now. Maybe you can sell off some personal items. I'm sure you still have some things of value." He thanked her and hung up, his chest tight. Sarah had managed his finances for over a decade. She'd earned millions in commissions from his success, yet she couldn't offer even a token gesture of support. Paul had always believed their relationship was rooted in mutual trust, but her reaction confirmed it had been little more than business. Greg's test unfolded differently. Paul had arranged to run into him at a networking event disguised as a local charity gala. Wearing thrift store clothes and a patched jacket, Paul approached Greg during the cocktail hour. Greg's initial reaction was one of surprise, but not the warm kind Paul had hoped for. "Paul, wow, you're here," Greg said, his eyes darting to Paul's threadbare jacket. "Didn't expect to see you out and about these days." Paul feigned a sheepish grin. "Trying to keep my spirits up. Things have been rough, but I'm looking for opportunities to get back on track." Greg chuckled awkwardly and patted Paul on the shoulder. "That's the spirit, man. But you know how it is. These events are more about connections. Maybe you can find someone here who can help you out." It was clear Gray had no intention of associating with Paul and his perceived lower status. As the evening wore on, Paul noticed Greg deliberately avoiding him, steering conversations away whenever Paul approached. Still, not all of Paul's encounters left him disillusioned. One morning at the diner, a middle-aged woman named Lisa struck up a conversation with him. Lisa had been coming to the diner for years, always sitting at the same booth near the window. Her warm smile and unassuming nature stood out in stark contrast to the indifference Paul had encountered elsewhere. "You're new here," Lisa said as Paul cleared her table. "You've got the look of someone who's seen better days." Paul chuckled softly. "You could say that. Life's thrown me a few curveballs lately." Lisa nodded knowingly. "Been there. Lost my husband a few years back, and everything fell apart for a while. But you keep going. You find out who really matters." Her words struck a chord with Paul. Over the next few weeks, Lisa became a regular fixture in his life. She would stop by the diner, often lingering to chat with him after her meal. She never pried, never judged, just offered genuine kindness. For the first time since his self-imposed exile began, Paul felt seen, not as a millionaire or a man who'd lost it all, but simply as himself. But even as Paul found solace in Lisa's friendship, the weight of Tom's betrayal lingered. He couldn't shake the memory of Tom's smug tone at the bar or his hollow words at the community center. Paul decided it was time to push the boundaries of his experiment. He needed to know how far Tom would go to protect his own interests, even if it meant further undermining Paul. Paul crafted a scenario to test Tom's integrity. He arranged for a mutual acquaintance, a lawyer named David, to approach Tom with a fabricated legal opportunity. The deal involved buying out one of Paul's former properties, which had been seized as part of his bankruptcy. David would propose the deal as a chance for Tom to acquire the property at a fraction of its value, essentially profiting from Paul's downfall. The plan unfolded over the next week. Paul, hidden behind the scenes, waited anxiously for David's report. When the call came, Paul's heart sank. Tom didn't even hesitate. David said, his voice tinged with regret. He'd jumped at the chance, even asked if there were more properties he could look into. Paul hung up, his hands trembling. The betrayal was complete. Tom wasn't just indifferent to Paul's plight. He was actively exploiting it for personal gain. The experiment had laid bare the truth, but it also left Paul grappling with a profound sense of loss. He had sacrificed everything to uncover the reality of his relationships, and now that he wasn't sure it had been worth the cost. As Paul sat in his tiny apartment that evening, staring at the peeling wallpaper, he thought about Lisa's words. "You find out who really matters." In the wreckage of his old life, he had uncovered a handful of people who were genuine, people like Lisa. But he had also exposed the hollowness of relationships he once held dear. For now, Paul's next move was clear. He would confront Tom, not out of anger but a need for closure. The experiment wasn't just about testing loyalty. It was about understanding the people around him, and ultimately, himself. And as painful as the truth was, Paul knew it was the first step toward rebuilding a life rooted in authenticity. The days following Paul's realization about Tom's betrayal felt like a blur. It wasn't just that his best friend had taken advantage of his misfortune. It was the gut-wrenching realization that the very foundation of their friendship had been built on shaky ground. As Paul continued to navigate his new life, it became clearer that his experiment was beginning to unravel in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had come to learn that betrayal wasn't limited to Tom alone. It was the people closest to him, those who had benefited from his success, that made him question everything. Paul's routine had changed. The mornings no longer began with the sound of buzzing cell phones or hurried meetings. He had traded boardrooms for diner booths, expensive watches for worn-out shoes. It was humbling, yet he couldn't escape the gnawing sensation of emptiness that followed him everywhere. Each day, Paul found himself thinking about the ones who hadn't been part of his rich life, the ones who still treated him like a human being despite his fall from grace. Lisa, who worked at the coffee shop down the street from his apartment, had become an anchor in his otherwise lonely existence. She didn't treat him like a charity case. She treated him like a person, a quality Paul hadn't realized he was missing until he experienced it firsthand. Every time he spoke to Lisa, whether it was in the small cafe or after her shift when she'd sit down at his table to chat, Paul found solace in her words. She had her own story of hardship and survival. Her husband's death had left her a widow far too soon, and the financial struggle that followed had forced her to find strength in herself she never knew she had. They'd shared long conversations about how the world can either break you or make you stronger, how betrayal was often disguised as well-meaning advice, and how people who had never walked in your shoes would never understand the weight of your burdens. But as much as Lisa helped Paul in ways no one else could, the thoughts of Tom remained a bitter wound. Tom had been more than a friend. He had been a brother. They had shared secrets, dreams, and fears over countless nights of laughing until dawn. To think that Tom had not only abandoned him during his greatest time of need, but had also actively participated in the destruction of Paul's life in order to gain personal advantage left a sickening taste in his mouth. Paul knew what he had to do. The time had come to confront Tom, to face him head-on, and demand the truth. The following weekend, Paul made his way to Murphy's, the bar where he had first overheard Tom's casual dismissal of their friendship. He couldn't deny the anxiety that tightened in his chest as he walked inside. The low hum of chatter and the clink of beer mugs filled the air. There, at a corner booth, sat Tom, laughing with a group of people who seemed oblivious to the strained history between them. The sight of Tom, dressed in a crisp suit, laughing with ease, only fueled the fire inside Paul. Tom looked so different now. He was a man who had clearly moved on, leaving Paul behind in the rubble of his old life. Taking a deep breath, Paul approached the booth. Tom's eyes flicked up for a second before recognition set in. He blinked, clearly surprised to see Paul. "Paul, what are you doing here?" Tom asked, his voice betraying a slight unease. "I could ask you the same thing," Paul said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of emotion. "I heard about your little speech at the community center. Nice touch, using my name to bolster your reputation. But I think it's time we have a real conversation, Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Look, I don't know what you're getting at. I've been busy trying to rebuild, you know." "I've been watching you rebuild, all right," Paul said, his tone colder now. "It's funny how people can talk about loyalty and friendship when they're not the ones who've been left in the dirt." Tom's smile faltered, but he quickly masked it with a defensive shrug. "You're twisting this. I've done nothing but try to help you, Paul." "Really?" Paul challenged, leaning in. "How exactly have you helped? When I needed you most, where were you? All you did was stand by and let me fall. And now, when I'm down, you found a way to profit from it. How long did you think I wouldn't find out about the property deal, Tom? How long did you think I'd let you use me to line your pockets?" The blood drained from Tom's face as the realization of Paul's knowledge set in. The air between them grew thick with tension. Paul, I didn't mean for things to get like this," Tom stammered. "It's just, when you're successful, people expect you to have everything figured out. They expect you to give and give and give. But no one ever asks how the person at the top is doing. And when you fell, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't watch you suffer and not do something about it. I had my own bills, my own pressures. I just wanted to get ahead for once. So you sold me out," Paul said, his voice sharp. "You turned your back on everything we built together just to save yourself." Tom's expression faltered, his eyes flickering with guilt. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Paul. I thought I was doing the right thing. I never thought it would come to this." There was a long, painful silence between them. Paul's anger was palpable, but so was his sadness. He had loved Tom like a brother, and yet, here they were, two men who had once shared everything now standing at the precipice of their friendship, unable to look the other in the eye. "You can't just claim to be my friend when things are easy and then turn away when it gets hard, Tom," Paul said quietly, his voice losing its edge, but still carrying the weight of everything unsaid. "Friendship isn't about how much you can take. It's about how much you're willing to give, even when it costs you something." Tom's face softened, the regret evident now. "I messed up, Paul, and I can't undo it. But if you'll let me, I want to try to make it right. I'll do anything." Paul stared at him for a long moment, processing the complexity of the situation. What could he do with all this? Was it possible to salvage any part of their relationship? Part of him wanted to walk away, to never look back at a person who had so easily betrayed him. But another part, small and fragile, wanted to believe that even after all this, there could be redemption. The decision wasn't easy. But one thing Paul had learned through all of this was that life wasn't just about measuring success or failure. It was about the choices you made, especially in the moments that mattered most. "I don't know, Tom," Paul finally said, his voice softer now. "I don't know if you can make it right, but I'm willing to listen. We'll see if you can prove it." As Paul left the bar that night, he wasn't sure what the future held. He didn't know if their friendship would survive, or if it would dissolve completely in the aftermath of the truth. But he did know one thing for certain: his experiment had taught him something invaluable. People's loyalty wasn't always about what they could gain or lose, but about how they showed up when it really counted. And though he still had scars from the betrayal, Paul felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Paul couldn't shake the feeling that his confrontation with Tom had been just the beginning of something much larger. While there was a part of him that was desperate to close the chapter on their friendship, another part still clung to the hope that the past could be salvaged. The weight of the conversation hung in the air, and as he walked away from Murphy's that night, he didn't feel the satisfaction he had expected. There were no victorious cheers, no sense of justice, just a heavy emptiness that followed him like a shadow. The days following the confrontation were a slow burn. Paul returned to his routine at the diner, scraping by as a dishwasher while pretending everything was normal. The steady hum of plates clinking together, the chatter of customers who didn't know his story. This became his world. Lisa was a comforting presence, always asking about his day, always listening without judgment. Her life had its struggles too, but she never seemed to carry them with the same weight Paul did. She offered a steady consistency that helped him cope, but every time he saw her, he couldn't help but feel like he was living a life that didn't belong to him. It was as though the person he once was, the successful millionaire, the entrepreneur with the Midas touch, had evaporated, leaving only fragments of his former self. Tom, for his part, didn't reach out immediately after their encounter. The silence between them was deafening. Paul had expected the usual attempts at reconciliation. Tom's calls, his messages, maybe a half-hearted apology. But none came. The weeks stretched on, and the lack of contact left Paul more unsettled than ever. He was left to wonder if Tom's apparent remorse was genuine, or just a convenient way to salvage what was left of his reputation. It seemed like every step Paul took toward finding clarity only led him deeper into uncertainty. It wasn't until the following month that the first real signs of change began to emerge. Paul was working the night shift at the diner when Tom unexpectedly walked in, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. His usually polished appearance was gone, replaced with the disheveled look of someone who'd been running on fumes. He stood at the counter for a moment, scanning the room, before locking eyes with Paul. "Can we talk?" Tom's voice was rough, worn. It wasn't the tone Paul had expected, and it caught him off guard. Despite the initial hesitation, Paul nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. He motioned for Tom to follow him to the small break room in the back. They stood there for a moment, the air thick with the tension of unspoken words. Tom's eyes were tired, his face drawn with the weight of something deeper than guilt. "Look, Paul, I'm sorry. I've been an idiot. I've been avoiding this, thinking I could fix things on my own. But I don't know how to fix this, how to fix me. But I'm trying." Tom's voice cracked as he spoke. "I lost myself when everything fell apart for you, and I've been trying to make sense of it all." Paul didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure what to say. There was a part of him that wanted to lash out, to let the anger he'd been holding back spill over. But another part of him, something softer, knew that wasn't the way forward. The man in front of him wasn't the same one who had betrayed him. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake, one that had cost both of them dearly. "I can't just forget what you did, Tom," Paul said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "You sold me out. You used me. And that's not something I can just ignore." Tom's face contorted with regret, his eyes filling with emotion. I know, Paul. And I've been paying for it. I've been thinking about you, about us, about everything. You were my best friend. And I let all of that go for what? A quick way out? I was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away, and I was too scared to admit that I'd failed you." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Paul could hear the hum of the diner outside, the clink of silverware, and the low murmur of conversations, but it all felt so distant. In this small, cramped break room, it was just the two of them. It was impossible to ignore the weight of the moment. Paul's mind raced, torn between the anger that still burned in him and the part that yearned for the brotherhood they once shared. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Tom," Paul finally said, his voice low. "Not yet. I need time. But I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to see if you can prove that you've changed." Tom's face lit up with a flicker of hope. "I can, Paul. I swear, I can. Just give me a chance. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Paul nodded slowly, the words not coming easily. But he knew that this wasn't about what Tom could do. It was about what Paul could allow himself to believe. Could he ever trust Tom again? Could their friendship be salvaged, or was it too far gone? There were no clear answers. "I'm not sure what comes next," Paul said quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But I'll give you a chance, Tom. But don't make me regret it." Tom exhaled deeply, a look of relief washing over him. "I won't. I promise." Over the next few months, things between Paul and Tom began to slowly change. There was no instant forgiveness, no miraculous recovery, but there was progress. Tom started showing up for Paul in ways that mattered. Small acts of kindness, a phone call here and there, offering to help with things without any expectation in return. Tom's efforts, while small, spoke volumes, and Paul, though still cautious, began to see glimpses of the man he had once called a brother. Meanwhile, the community around Paul continued to evolve as well. The word had spread that the once prominent millionaire was now living like everyone else. People who had once turned their backs on him now sought him out, not out of pity, but out of genuine interest in his story. It was almost surreal how quickly the tides had shifted. But as much as it stung, Paul couldn't deny that he had found something valuable in his descent. The understanding that his worth was never tied to his wealth. It was tied to his character, to the connections he made, and to how he treated others when things were hard. Lisa, who had become a steady presence in his life, was a constant reminder of that truth. She never asked for anything from Paul. She didn't care about his past successes or his fall from grace. She saw him for who he was, an imperfect man trying to rebuild, and that was enough. In the end, Paul's experiment hadn't just tested the loyalty of his friends, it had tested his own resilience. He had learned that true friendship wasn't about wealth or status. It was about integrity, trust, and being willing to stand by each other when everything else was gone. As Paul walked out of the diner one evening, his heart was lighter than it had been in months. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The days that followed Paul's decision to allow Tom a second chance were filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. His life, once dictated by luxury and the hustle of high-stakes business, had become an entirely different rhythm. He no longer sought approval from the world's elite, nor did he feel the weight of expectations that once pressed on his shoulders. What mattered now were the relationships that remained, the ones that had survived not because of what he could offer, but because of who he was. In the quiet of the nights, Paul reflected on the sacrifices he had made, not for financial gain, but for the chance to rebuild. This time, not just his empire, but his heart. Tom had shown up at the diner every week for the past month, quietly earning back the trust Paul had almost written off. It wasn't grand gestures or empty apologies that had begun to shift Paul's perspective. It was the small things. The subtle changes in Tom's behavior were undeniable. He showed up early to help Paul clean the diner after hours, even bringing in a bag of groceries for the staff once, insisting it was no big deal. Tom also began to reach out, checking in with Paul on days when the weight of his new life seemed too much to carry. It was as if he was trying to undo the damage, brick by brick, and while the process was slow, there was something unmistakable in his sincerity. But the true test came when Paul received a call from his old business partner, Greg. The news shook Paul to his core. The company Paul had once built was now teetering on the brink of collapse. Despite Paul's fall from grace, the ripple effect of his loss had begun to pull others down with it. Greg explained that the market downturn had caught up with them all, and they were now facing legal challenges over some of the investments Paul had made before his so-called collapse. The real estate firm that had once been one of the most respected in the city was now under investigation. "Paul, I'm not asking for a handout," Greg said over the phone, his voice low and strained. "But we need to know what you're going to do. We need a plan. You're the one who built this thing, and now it's falling apart. If you can't help us, we're done." The weight of the decision hit Paul hard. He had already been through so much: financial ruin, betrayal, and the slow process of healing. But this was different. He wasn't just being asked to salvage his own reputation anymore. He was being asked to save the company, the people who had worked for him, and the lives that had been tied to his success. He didn't know if he could do it. He wasn't sure if he even had the strength left. It was then that Tom called him, his voice full of concern when Paul shared the news. "I can't believe this is happening, man," Tom said, his tone serious. "But you're not alone in this. You know that, right? I'm here for you." The words were simple, but they were enough to give Paul a brief moment of hope. Tom had no obligation to help. He had his own business to manage, his own life to rebuild. But he was standing by Paul, not as a savior, but as a friend. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Paul. This was the man who had betrayed him, the man who had taken advantage of his fall. But now, it seemed like Tom was the only one who hadn't abandoned him. He realized, in that moment, that his experiment wasn't over yet. There was still work to be done, not just in rebuilding the company, but in rebuilding trust, in proving that people could rise from the ashes. Paul called Greg back later that evening, telling him he would step in and help in whatever way he could. "We'll figure this out," Paul said with a resolve that surprised even him. "But we're doing this the right way this time. No more shortcuts. No more cutting corners." The weeks that followed were grueling. Paul spent long hours combing through financial statements, meeting with lawyers, and working tirelessly to restructure the company. At times, it felt like he was drowning, but Tom was there, quietly supporting him every step of the way. Together, they dug through the rubble of the business, reconstructing deals and renegotiating contracts. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real. The process was slow, and there were plenty of setbacks, but with each small victory, Paul felt like he was gaining back a little bit of the life he had once taken for granted. As the weeks turned into months, the company slowly began to stabilize. The legal issues were far from resolved, but they were manageable. The employees who had been uncertain of their futures now had a glimmer of hope. The once dying real estate firm had a chance at survival, thanks to the relentless efforts of Paul, Tom, and a handful of loyal employees who had refused to give up on what they had built together. But it wasn't just the company that was changing. Paul himself was changing. He was no longer the man who defined himself by his wealth and success. The road he had walked had stripped him of his ego and his pride, and in their place, he had discovered something far more valuable: the understanding that true success wasn't about financial gain, but about relationships, loyalty, and resilience. He had learned that people, despite their flaws, could surprise you, and that even the most fractured relationships could heal if the effort was made. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Paul found himself at the old coffee shop, sitting across from Lisa. The place was quieter now, the buzz of the crowd replaced with the soothing hum of the espresso machine. Lisa smiled as she placed a cup of coffee in front of him, her eyes full of understanding. "You look like you've been through a war," she said with a gentle laugh, but there was no mockery in her voice, just a quiet acknowledgement of everything Paul had been through. "I have," Paul admitted, rubbing his eyes, "but I think I'm starting to see that the fight was worth it." Lisa leaned back in her chair, her expression soft. "It always is, isn't it? The things that really matter, they're the hardest to earn." Paul nodded, his gaze drifting out the window to the fading sunset. The world outside seemed to move at its own pace, unaffected by the storms he had weathered. But inside, Paul knew he was no longer the man who had once measured his worth by his bank balance. The riches had gone, the friends who had taken advantage had faded away, and the company that had once been his pride had almost collapsed. But in its place, he had something that mattered far more. He had integrity, he had loyalty, and he had the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, he was capable of rising again. "Maybe the hardest thing," Paul said quietly, "was learning who I really am, and what really matters." Lisa smiled, her eyes full of a quiet knowing, and maybe, just maybe, that's the real success. As the evening settled into the quiet rhythm of the city, Paul realized that though the road had been long and painful, it had brought him something more precious than anything money could buy. He had found a new beginning, not just for his company, but for himself. And as he left the coffee shop that night, walking into the cool evening air, Paul knew one thing for certain: the journey was far from over. But this time, he was ready for whatever came next. As the months passed, Paul began to realize that the hardest part of his journey wasn't the collapse of his wealth or the betrayal of those closest to him. It was the internal transformation he had to undergo. The man he had been before, the successful millionaire who thrived on power and status, no longer seemed relevant. That version of himself, with all his confidence and certainty, felt like a distant memory, almost as though it belonged to someone else. What was left of him now was raw, vulnerable, but far more genuine than he had ever been before. Through the process of rebuilding the company, Paul found something that had been missing for years: the satisfaction of earning something back, not through shortcuts or leveraging his past, but through hard work, humility, and trust. His relationship with Tom had grown stronger. There were still moments of doubt and tension, but Tom's continued efforts to prove himself, small, consistent actions of loyalty and honesty, slowly healed the rift between them. It was a delicate dance, but they were making progress, and for the first time in a long while, Paul felt a sense of hope for the future. And then there was Lisa. She remained a steadfast presence in his life, offering not just companionship, but a perspective that grounded him. Lisa wasn't interested in Paul's past wealth or business deals. She was more interested in the person he had become. Their conversations were never about what Paul could offer, but about what they could share. They spoke about their hopes, their fears, and the lessons they had learned from life. Lisa had her own scars, but she never wore them as a badge of shame. Instead, she wore them as part of her story, and in her quiet, unassuming way, she reminded Paul that there was strength in vulnerability. One evening, after another long day at the office, Paul sat with Lisa at the small park near the coffee shop. The autumn air was crisp, and the falling leaves seemed to echo the changes that had taken place in Paul's life. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the park. It was a peaceful moment, one that contrasted sharply with the chaos Paul had once lived in. "You know, it's funny," Paul said, looking out at the horizon. I used to think that success was about making the most money, having the biggest house, the best cars. But now, I'm not so sure. It's all so empty. All those things I thought mattered, they don't anymore." Lisa smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding that had drawn Paul to her from the very beginning. "I think you're starting to figure it out," she said, her voice gentle. "True success is never about what you have, Paul. It's about who you become in the process." Paul nodded, the weight of her words settling deeply in his chest. The journey had been long, filled with moments of doubt, pain, and self-discovery, but it had also been transformative. He had learned to look beyond the superficial markers of success and find value in the things that really mattered: loyalty, integrity, and the relationships that endured even when everything else crumbled. Just as the thought of his transformation began to sink in, a familiar face appeared from across the park. Tom, looking more tired than usual, approached with hesitation in his steps. Paul couldn't help but notice the subtle difference in his posture. There was no arrogance, no bravado, just a man who had been through his own version of the ringer and had come out the other side. "Hey," Tom greeted, a bit awkwardly but with genuine warmth. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Paul glanced at Lisa, who nodded knowingly before standing up to give them some space. He watched her walk off, her quiet presence offering him the comfort he needed as Tom sat beside him on the bench. "I've been thinking about everything," Tom started, his voice carrying an unusual heaviness. "About how I let you down, how I took advantage of you when you were at your lowest. And I know I can't undo it, but I want you to know that I've changed. I've been working on myself, trying to understand why I did what I did. And I don't expect anything from you, Paul. But I just needed to say that I'm sorry. And I'll keep doing whatever it takes to prove that I'm not the same person I was before." Paul took a deep breath, the words weighing heavily on him. This wasn't the Tom he had once known. The cocky, confident man who had always had an excuse for everything now sat before him, stripped of his defenses. He saw the sincerity in Tom's eyes, the same sincerity that had begun to build between them over the past few months. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for reconciliation after all. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Tom," Paul said slowly. "What you've done, you've already done. I can't change that, and I won't try to. But I'm willing to believe in the person you are now. That's all I need from you. Just show me that you've learned from your mistakes." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. "I will, I swear. I'll show you." The air between them, which had once been thick with tension, seemed to lighten. It wasn't a grand resolution, but it was a step forward, a quiet understanding that they could rebuild what had been lost, not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it. The weight of betrayal, though still lingering, began to lift, replaced by the hope of a new beginning. As they sat in the park, the evening settling around them, Paul felt a strange sense of peace. It was the first time in a long while that he could truly say he felt whole. The pieces of his life, broken and scattered by betrayal and loss, were finally starting to come together. His work, his relationships, and his understanding of who he was had all been tested. And in that testing, he had found something far more valuable than success or money. He had found the strength to rise again, not as the man he once was, but as the man he had always been meant to be. With a deep breath, Paul stood up, offering Tom a nod of acknowledgement. "Let's go grab a drink. We've got a lot to catch up on." Tom smiled, the first genuine smile Paul had seen in a long time. As they walked together into the night, Paul realized that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready for whatever came next. The past had shaped him, yes, but it no longer defined him. It was time to move forward, not just with his company, but with his life. And this time, he would do it with the people who truly mattered by his side.